If you have a Bible, please turn to Exodus 14, and I will read for us from verse 19. Then the angel of God, who had been travelling in front of Israel's army, withdrew and went behind them. The pillar of cloud also moved from in front and stood behind them, coming between the armies of Egypt and Israel. And throughout the night the cloud brought darkness to one side and light to the other, so neither went near the other all night long. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and all that night the Lord drove the sea back with a strong east wind and turned it into dry land. The waters were divided, and the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground with a wall of water on their left and on their right. So we're finishing this series on impossible. And the focus for this series, if you have missed it, has been about with God nothing is impossible. We looked at the stories of Mary in Luke, and she says with God nothing is impossible. Jesus himself in Matthew 19 says with man this is not possible, but with God everything is possible. And I have, the few times that I've been speaking in this series, have shared this thought with us, and I share it again at the end of this series today. Unless our lives, your life, my life, has crossed over into the impossible, it has not given adequate witness to Jesus. Unless your life, my life, if you are a follower of Jesus, has crossed over into God's impossible, well, it's possible for God, we haven't given adequate witness to Jesus. And what I mean by that is this: the normal Christian life is to experience God's possible, to live out of something that is impossible without him being involved in our life. For us to look at our own lives, for our friends and our neighbours to look at our lives and say, how is this possible? And for us to say, it's Jesus. So when COVID is over, and it will be at some point, we will remember it. I think about, maybe I'll talk to my grandchildren, granddad, grandpa, whatever I'm going to get called. Tell me, what was COVID like? And I wonder if my remembrances will be like everybody else's. Will I talk about unemployment and the pandemic and vaccinations and furlough and all the other things? Or will I be able to look back and tell people how I saw God's deliverance and God's impossible? Romans 8. I've got a couple of Bible verses that might not pop up on the screen because I'm praying through my talk this morning, and I apologise for the AV team for that. Paul writes this: "For I am convinced that neither death nor life, neither angels nor demons, neither the present nor the future, nor any powers, neither height nor depth, nor anything else in all creation will be able to separate us from the love of God that is in Christ Jesus our Lord." Most amazing passage. I think Paul was trying at great pains to say nothing. And he was looking into the future, not even politics, not Brexit, not COVID, not Donald Trump, not anything can separate us from God's love. And I love the bit at the beginning where Paul says, "For I am convinced." And you know what, brothers and sisters, as I stand here before you today and preparing for this, at the end of this series, I am convinced, I am, that nothing can separate us. Are you? So before we unpack the passage, I've got three things I want to share from the passage. I just want to tell you why I'm revisiting it today. On the very first Sunday in September, if you were listening to the live stream, I shared what was my best attempt at a prophetic word, listening to the Lord and praying. And he reminded me of this passage. I didn't teach from it, but I shared from it as a metaphor. And I've heard many of you in messages and WhatsApps and emails, or as I've had personal meetings, reflect that back to me. And that's a sign for me that it was helpful. And I feel the need to revisit it today. So before we look at the passage and I teach three things from it, I wanted to come back to the word that I shared, because it is a word that continues to guide us. If you're wondering, that thing about vision, where are we going? What's the church doing? What's our plan? This is the metaphor and the word of part of what we believe God's saying to us. So there's this image of how we want to cross together. I shared back in September that crossing the Red Sea in this story, like the people of Israel, we have the opportunity as part of God's church to cross together, and we want to cross through this time together. Now in Exodus, it might have been around 500,000 people. The sea piled up on either side of them. It took hours to cross, fleeing from an enemy, wondering if the sea would come down and drown them. And I felt God give me 3 images, imagining you. And I do. I pray for you regularly and daily. I imagine, some of you might know, I imagine going through a Sunday service in my head. And when I stand up here and speak, I think about you sitting on your sofas right now, or in bed, or wherever you are. And imagine meeting you. And imagine us crossing the Red Sea together. And I imagine this as I was praying through this, that some of us are at the front. There was somebody at the front when they crossed the Red Sea, and usually that would be the fit people, the healthy people, the excited people, the up for it people. And in COVID, some of you are maybe at the front because your job's going well, you're fit and healthy, you're financially secure. This isn't going to affect you massively. Maybe you're doing spiritually well as you pursue the Lord at the front of this. But I felt the Lord want to heed something for some of us and say that there is a danger to make sure we do not forget those who are behind us. And here's the diagnostic to know if you are forgetting the people who are behind you as we go through COVID. There is a criticism, a criticalness and a judgmentalism that surfaces, and we can look back and go, what's wrong with them? Why are they taking so long? Why are they so fearful? Why are they so anxious? Why aren't they trusting God more? Or a phrase that might bubble up, a criticism of the church and God's people. And I felt the Lord say, watch for that, because that's not what he would have us do as his people. Instead, I believe he would have us do this, and here's how I felt the Holy Spirit show me this picture in my head. Those of us at the front would be the people cheering everybody else on. Come on, you can do this. We'd be running back after having got to safety, going into danger to help other people, to pick up their burdens. Let me carry that for you. Let me help you across, to help people and say this, how can I help you? If you're at the front and you're not asking how you can help others, something might be lacking. And then there's a whole bunch of us in the middle. And you're doing okay. You're not complaining. You're picking people up along the way, and you're being faithful, and you're looking forward to getting to the other side. But it's not massively exciting. You don't particularly, in the image, I felt God say, you're not massively feeling God's presence. And I felt God say this to you. It's okay. This is a season for not growing weary in doing good. And the joy will come later. Just keep on keeping on. And then some of us are at the back. Some of us due to loss, health, fear, many reasons. God may seem very, very, very far away at the minute. Maybe you're tuning in today for the first time and you haven't tuned into anything very much at all. Maybe it's just been one long struggle and you've probably given up looking for God, overwhelmed by what you see around you. And the Lord doesn't want you left behind. He doesn't want you to stay on the other shore. We want to take us together. So that's the impossible as we come to the end of this series. The impossibility of a church in COVID crossing together, arriving post-COVID, where we will. And by the way, it is an absolute pain in the, I nearly used the wrong word then, backside. About Christmas, I'm immensely disappointed. There are things going on in the spiritual realm and battles for places, and we're not the only church doing that. It's like, oh, Lord, one more thing. But this is the impossible. We will, if we choose to, come through this together as part of God's people, and we will one day be together and we will celebrate God's goodness and all he did for us. Just as we're going to see in this story in a moment, God's people celebrate this story in history as the greatest act of deliverance that he ever did for them. So I felt led to teach on this passage now. 3 short things that I hope will build up your faith beyond that word and the metaphor into the impossible to experience God. Now, crossing the Red Sea, some of you know your New Testament. This story is picked up several times in the New Testament, and it's picked up as an example of who Jesus is and baptism and God's rescue for his people. This is more than just a metaphor. It is an experience that we are meant to have in our lives through Jesus. It's likened to baptism. Some of you, have you ever read Jude? There's only one chapter in Jude. It's kind of funny. Jude 5, there's no chapter 5, it's just verse 5, actually uses this word. Jesus saved Israel from Egypt. Isn't that strange? It's that explicit. It was Jesus that saved Israel when they went through the Red Sea. And in 1 Corinthians 10, Paul, about 3 times, uses this story and he said, let this be an example, example, example. This is how we should go through difficult times, Paul says. And most of all, the reason this passage is so powerful is this. Jesus at the Last Supper took place during Passover. Everybody was celebrating the deliverance from Egypt and the going through of the Red Sea, and that is the time when Jesus celebrated the Last Supper and Easter took place. So 3 things. I'm going to share with you 3 things. First one, suffering and resilience. The second one, how God may use COVID to deliver you from bondage. And the third thing, that when God saves us, he chooses the route, not us. So, you ready? First one. Can any of you remember what you hoped for when the new year began for 2020? Does anybody remember that? Did you make your list for this year? I'm sure no one was hoping for a pandemic. I know I wasn't. It's kind of funny when I go back and I look to the goals I set for the year and my plans for the year. I'm like, I had absolutely no idea. And you know that old adage, how do you want to make God laugh? Make plans for your life. And probably, if you're like me, your list was of positive things and growth things and good things and expectations and hopes for the year. I love one of the Christmas carols that we'll be singing or listening to, that in Jesus, at Christmas, the hopes and fears of all the year are met in thee tonight. But it's interesting, Romans 5, and again, I'm sorry, I'm not sure if I gave this to the AV team. It's kind of strange. Paul tells us what our hope should be, the normal basis for Christian hope. And he says this, not only so, but we also glory in our sufferings. What a strange phrase, glory in our sufferings. Because we know that suffering produces perseverance, perseverance character, and character hope, and hope does not put us to shame, because God's love has been poured out into our hearts through the Holy Spirit who has been given to us. Strange, isn't it? Glory in suffering? That's where Paul begins. That's where hope is birthed. We live in the Western world that more than ever tries to avoid suffering, pain, and responsibility. Actually, we live at a time of history, even no matter what difficulties we're going through, we as a group of people in the Western world have more provision and more protection than any human beings at any time in history, and we seem to struggle more than ever with suffering. And Christians often struggle the most with the idea of suffering. And yet suffering is normal to the Christian life. Jesus tells it is. We've looked at this in the series. And what do we glory in? Well, we often glory in escape, don't we? We glory in lack of responsibility. We glory in freedom. We glory in ease. We glory in comfort. We glory in leisure. Those are all the things that we aspire to and hope for. And yet that way of life is literally making us sick. Our mental health is worse. Young people have worse self-harm than ever with those aspirations for life. And by the way, that's not Christians making those surveys of that. That's psychologists and psychiatrists saying the less that we suffer, the worse we're becoming in some ways. And you know what? Psychologists are specialists that study human beings and our health and wholeness, are discovering more and more that we were made to bear burdens. Does that surprise you? In other words, psychologists are discovering that if you want to be well, you need to take responsibility and bear a burden and struggle in life to be healthy and well and happy. I heard a psychologist, I've been doing reading on this. And he made this invitation in a video in responding to a question. He said, if you want to be healthy and whole in life, take on the greatest responsibility that you can just about bear, commit to it and suffer for a purpose, then you will be happy. I'm like, oh my goodness, that sounds a bit familiar, doesn't it? You wonder why Jesus said, pick up your cross and follow me. The rich young man. Jesus looked at him, loved him, and said, one thing you lack, sell everything you have, pick up my cross, Jesus said, and come follow me. And then you will be happy. Interesting psychologists are discovering something Jesus has told us for 2,000 years. Now, epigenetically, I love that word. What that means is we have DNA in our body and we have things that respond. By the way, it's epigenetically, if you smoke, there are parts of the way that you are made that respond to that and can lead to cancer. Okay? Your body responds to it. Things are switched on in a bad way. But epigenetically, we are behavioral scientists are discovering that even when you're 70 or 80 years old, if you do certain things, your body will respond and lead to growth and health and life. And having no responsibilities and no commitments is one of the worst things for you to do. Now, please bear with me while I finish this bit. George Bonanno, I think that's how you say his name, Bonanno. There's a key studies, one of those studies, 600 children that he surveyed extensively, that has formed the backbone of what psychologists and psychiatrists and mental health specialists are discovering about suffering and growth. And then I'll tell you why all of this is vital to our understanding. He looked at 600 children who had suffered the worst that you and I could ever imagine, but something very surprising. These children often had greater emotional stability than young people who had been protected from any suffering by their parents. The more you protect your children from struggles and responsibilities, the more unhealthy they will be. Now, he wasn't justifying the suffering these children went through. It was horrific. But he coined a phrase that's used, and I want to use this to frame the rest of what I share with you today. He said, we need to stop talking about post-traumatic stress disorder. That was traumatic. And actually, he talked about this, potentially traumatic events. Some of you will know, if you've been following me, I interviewed a Christian therapist, a trauma specialist, right at the beginning of lockdown, serialized the whole thing. It's been listened to thousands of times, different people listening to it. And he said this to me as well. He said, it's not what happens to you that's traumatic, it's how you perceive it and respond to it that causes trauma. Potentially traumatic events. And let me say this. In other words, it's not what happens to us, but it's how we perceive it and determine what's happened to us that causes trauma. In other words, it's the difference between what we go through and what we do with what we went through. Does that make sense? It's the difference between what we go through and how we perceive and respond to what we've gone through. So why is that important? Because, secondly, God's people faced major PTE. Now, the people of Israel, by the way, I will mention this. Have you noticed the story of the Passover that Jewish people still celebrate today? Jesus steps into Passover. The people of Israel don't say, wasn't that the most traumatic, awful thing that we went through? And we curse God for the sufferings that we had. No, the Passover was awful. But because of it, God liberated us. It was the greatest moment of God's deliverance for his people. And again, if you go back and read it with all the plagues and everything that took place. But God's people decided that this would be a PTE moment, that they would look back and celebrate it every year of God's deliverance and God's involvement in their lives. Now, here's the PTE for the people of Israel. 400 years as slaves, forced labor, oppressed, abused. They hadn't even been taken captive. They'd gone to Egypt under Joseph and escaped to famine. But over time, they forgot to serve God and they let themselves become captive to relying on the Egyptians. And you see that bondage at the moment when they stand here in this story at the edge of the Red Sea, and they start to complain and say, it's better back there. It's safer back there. This is too much for us. Their perception of some people was, this is traumatic, I don't want to go through this. They were taken captive over time, and they couldn't see the bondage that they were in. And here's my thought for us on this, if you can bear with me in this. It might be that in COVID, you are discovering now some of the things you have become captive to over time. You've heard the metaphor of the frog in the kettle. If you put a frog in boiling water, it jumps out. But if you put a frog in water and heat it up slowly, it will stay there till it dies. There's something about life and time. You've probably found yourself at some point in life going, how did I get here? How did things get to this condition? And maybe some stuff is coming out in COVID. You're like, why am I feeling that, responding like that, behaving like that? Well, because you're in a PTE moment where God is revealing all that's been going up and growing around you. And you might be saying, I don't want this. I don't want to go through this. I want to go back to the plans that I had for 2020. And you know what? If we're honest, we do this all the time with life. Put ourselves into situations where we come into bondage. You might not feel that you're in bondage, but you might be discovering in COVID that you are, and I am. Here's some examples. We are so lonely and want companionship, and we settle for relationships that end up hurting us. Bev and I have been pastors in this church for 23 years, and we've seen people, because of their loneliness, enter into relationships that eventually cause them more harm. We fear provision and God providing for us, so we sell part of our soul to jobs that we hate. We do that regularly for fear. And then some of us leverage our life with lifestyles. We give our time and our energy and our money to things that mean we are mortgaged to a way of life that stops us saying yes to what God has for us. We do that all the time, and we're prone to it. So what if COVID was being used by God to rescue you and I from the bondage that we've become enslaved to? The places and spaces in our identity where we would rather be safe than pursuing God. What if you and I can never get free from Egypt unless God allowed COVID to happen? Third and last thing. When God saves you, he chooses the route. Now, in Matthew 2, there's this other allusion to the story of Egypt, and it's made explicit. Joseph and Mary take Jesus and they escape to Egypt. And in Matthew 2, verse 14, quotes Hosea in the Old Testament, a prophecy. Out of Egypt I have called my son. Israel was God's son. Jesus was literally God's son. Most of us, until COVID took place, probably couldn't relate to this story of crossing the Red Sea in any way. Couldn't imagine it at all. But we might be able to connect to it a little bit more now. I'm part of a generation that grew up without a war. I mean, the Falklands War. I'm watching The Crown at the minute. Oh, I love The Crown. Anyway, won't go there. But going to war without a plague, at the pinnacle of human prosperity in human history. But I tell you what, I can relate a lot more to this story now due to social distancing and laws and redundancy and furlough and danger to people and political turmoil the like I have never seen. Now, 1 Corinthians 10, verse 13, I think this verse will appear on, I think this one I gave to the team. When I read this passage, it says temptation. By temptation, it also means testing. No testing has overtaken you except what is common to mankind, and God is faithful. He will not let you be tested beyond what you can bear, and when you are tested, he will also provide a way out so that you can endure it. Look at the end of that verse. God will also provide a way out so that you can endure it. This is God's promise to you right now with whatever you are dealing with. And the key is this. God provides the way, not you and I. I know how I would like to get out of COVID. There's lots of things I imagine sometimes. I mean, maybe I should enter the Euro lottery that's rolled over for a sixth time. That would be a great escape, wouldn't it? Or things going back to normal, or burying my head in the sand. There's lots of ways we would like to escape. Now, I think I'm saying this. When God brings you out of something, when God delivers you, do you remember how we began this? When God delivers you with his impossible, not a vaccination that everybody else may have, not the economy growing that everybody else will benefit from, but when God himself has delivered you, the impossible that is only something he can do, he chooses the route. Not you, not I. He makes the way. If you don't believe me, let's finish here looking at the story. We know in the story here that Israel arrived at the Red Sea. This was a bad route. There were other ways they could have escaped that were shorter, faster, and didn't involve arriving at a sea with an army behind them. It's one of the reasons they were all complaining. The passage is so honest about it. There was this pillar of there was the cloud and the pillar of fire, and they were following it. But God's people are like, my sat-nav tells me that way was much quicker. If I was going, I would have gone that way. Have you ever noticed that with God? We say yes to him and we end up in situations and we think, I wouldn't have chosen this way. Exactly. It's his to choose, not ours. So, God wanted to show them, the Israelites, that what they had become enslaved to, remember that I talked about a moment ago. Bear with me, I'm going to land this. The only way for them to see the bondage that they had been in for 400 years was to take them on this crazy route and bring them to the edge of the Red Sea so that they would see that God would deliver them while everything in them was screaming, I wish we'd never left. I want to go back. We're about to die. I don't like this. Faced with the Red Sea, I want to go back. But we know in the story, the east wind blows and the seas part, and Moses has to have faith and stretch out his hand, and the people of Israel have to have faith to cross over. Again, we know these people were not massively full of faith. If I was walking for 4 hours with the sea parted on the left and the right of me, I'd be talking to my mates going, Dave's on AV this morning. I go, Dave, do you think that's going to stay up there? Well, I want to run to the front, but we're supposed to help people, but I want to save myself. We're going to drown. It was better when we were back home. And the people of Israel had to have faith to cross. Now, some of you have had God bring you through things. I'm looking through the camera right now. I know some of you. Some of you I know, God brought you through the most awful things. But maybe you've forgotten. That's why the Bible tells us to remember and remember and remember. Do you know it's why the people of Israel celebrate the Passover every year? It's why Jesus at the Passover told the story again, but put himself into the story, because we have to remember, be remembered to, joined to, because we forget what God has done for us. And some of us, what we're going through at the moment, we have never discovered God's impossible. All we've done, we're realizing that I've gone through life relying on God to provide for me in Egypt, when God has wanted to rescue you from Egypt and bring you into his kingdom. And you're on the threshold of that if you want to enter into it. Right, that's my 30 minutes. So let me wrap this up with this. I'm prone to forget. Can I tell you a little story to finish? We've got time for the service. I want to tell you a little story. I found myself 3 weeks ago.